BlomCast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Welcome as always to the BlomCast, the podcast that looks at turning points in history. We've had a little hiatus in the last few weeks. I am in the middle of a manuscript. I'm not always as effective as I would like to be for you, but today I'm very excited to present you a special guest and a special topic. Kerry Brown, welcome to the BlomCast.
Hi, good to see you.
Kerry, you are one of the English-speaking world's best China experts. You are Professor of Chinese Studies at King's College in London, Director of the Lao China Institute. You taught at the University of Sydney. You were the leader of the head of the Asia program at Chatham House, the great foreign policy think tank in Britain. And you were a diplomat. You were first secretary at the British Embassy in Beijing for a long time. Just as a first question to get to know you a bit, and also for the audience to get to know you a bit, how come this fascination with China that has formed your life so much? Where did that come from?
So I can give you a one-word answer to that. Accident. Britain and China didn't have a great deal of kind of contact with each other when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s. But I went to King's College, Cambridge to do philosophy and English in the 80s, and the college had a very elderly but important sinologist, a guy called Joseph Needham, who was writing Science and Civilization in China. So I had a sort of vague start of awareness that there was this place, China, and it was super important. But in fact, my first attempt to go there in 1989 was scotched because of the Tiananmen Square uprising. I wanted to go and maybe teach for a few months there. So I went to Japan instead. But in 1991, I managed to go to China, and I think really it was a sort of revelation. I felt quite at home, weirdly. And then I went back and lived in the mid-1990s for 2 years. I learned to speak Chinese sort of properly. And really since then, I've kind of felt it's a second home. I don't know why. It's a sort of weird feeling. Maybe in my last life, I was a Chinese sort of, farmer or something. I feel a strange, kind of affinity with China, and I've always felt very comfortable there. And so it's been a pretty central part of my life ever since.
We're going to come back to that affinity later in a more analytical way. But how would you describe that affinity? What is it that appeals to you about Chinese culture? You have a lot of talks online, among them a TED Talk where you talk about the hybridity of Chinese thinking. And when I heard you talking about that, I had the impression that was quite meaningful to you.
I think China is a very networked society. And I'm reading a history of China's, comparisons with Europe since like 1,000 years before, since the Song dynasty. And, the argument of this book is that China is a communitarian society. It's a clan society. Never really had the sort of big legal kind of state and corporates in the way that Europe did, so that, your kind of main networks are often people you weren't really related to. In China, I think it's sort of all very, very much around networks and people. And I always found that fascinating and found it very human, even though, of course, China has industrialized and modernized, and the country that I've known has always been changing. I found that, humanity underneath is something I always really, really responded to. And I think also China is a sort of very similar kind of sense of humor to the British, very visual. And I've always found they like ambiguity. They like kind of puns, because Chinese language is full of sort of these, kind of similar sounding, words that, or parts of words that can kind of sound, completely different when you use them in different contexts. So I always sort of found that something I could respond to. And really, that's the basis of the fact that this is a very human society with these great, amazing networks. And it's always fascinating to work out what those networks mean.
Before we jump right into talk about the Great Reversal, which is a fascinating topic and really deserves a whole series and a much deeper investigation, just one question out of personal fascination. I've grown up between a few languages, and there's this old dispute in philosophy. You know what's coming, but I do want to ask. Um, in a different language, you have words for different things, for different emotions, for different states of the world. You can conceptualize different things. Are you someone somewhere else? Are you someone else when you're speaking Chinese? And in how far does language influence who we are?
Well, I think it's it's really critical, because I think if I didn't speak Chinese, I would have a different view of the country, and it would be less intimate. I mean, when I'm speaking Chinese, of course, in a sense, I'm the Chinese-speaking Kerry Brown. I'm still a foreigner. I don't suddenly become, Chinese, but I kind of sort of obviously have a different view of the world. The Chinese language is really unique because there's Indo-European languages, which is pretty much everything. And then there's Chinese. So, this kind of deep difference going back into history. And in fact, to talk about, the history, the British, when they originally encountered this language, they thought it was, hieroglyphics. They thought it was Egyptian. And one of the questions that they asked in the 18th century was, how did it that, this sort of language ended up in China? One guy, John Webb, in the 1660s, thought that it was because of Noah's Ark landing in China after the flood and his sons going out, and they set up this new language. So it's always puzzled people. But I think you're absolutely right. When you speak, a different language, you do become different. When I speak Chinese, one person said to me once, I sounded like a kind of an administrative official in one of the ethnic minority areas, because my Chinese is not obviously standard. It's sort of obvious that I'm speaking it as a second language, but I'm speaking it fluent enough for people to think, right, he must be part of this system. So it's kind of fascinating to get people's responses when you do obviously operate in Chinese in China.
Well, I tell you why I asked that, because it's a preoccupation with me, also because of AI and the fact that if you learn something, it transforms you. The process of learning transforms you. And I always have a feeling that we're getting more and more cheated of that process by having the results at our fingertips and no longer knowing what these results actually mean. But Kerry, you have written a book called The Great Reversal, which has become terribly topical somehow, or perhaps only people have caught on to how topical it really is. It is a story of the greatness, the subjugation, and the renewed greatness of China, and of the contest for power that especially Britain and China in this case had. You go back in history, you go back 4 centuries, but because we have only so little time, and there's so much to talk about, let's jump a little bit forward. Let's jump to the moment that really is a changing point in history, because there's also, I think, a very contemporary resonance to this. China is, in the 1830s, 1820s, 1830s, a vast empire conscious of its omnipotence, of its greatness, and knows that there is no serious rival for it. And then it all falls apart. Can you pass that story a little bit and let us in? Because the Opium Wars, or as you say, the Anglo-Chinese Wars, they are so little known here, and these events are so little known outside of China.
Yes, the dynastic the dynastic sort of history of China for 2,000 years was characterized by quite long periods of stability and continuity, and then catastrophic kind of changes. Sometimes it took decades. So I suppose in the 18th and 19th century, when the Qing dynasty, which was in power in China then, was sort of at its peak and then slowly declining, you had a kind of reiteration of that story where the central powers, the central bureaucracy, the kind of what we call the literary elite who ran the country basically through the Confucian exam system, like a meritocracy, quite unique. It went for almost 1,000 years. They were still in charge, but of a country that was increasingly kind of falling apart at a local level. And so Britain sort of was the main colonial or imperial industrialized power that came into that. And that's why it had such a big impact, because America wasn't yet anything like the player it is in the 20th and 21st century. France and Germany and Italy did appear, but they had really less of a stake. Their colonies were elsewhere. The Dutch, I think, had quite a big, impact through the Dutch East India Company. But it was really the British through the East India Company and then the British state that inserted itself into this story and opportunistically really kind of brought about an acceleration of the decline of the Qing. So, there's possibilities that the Qing dynasty without that external impact may have continued for a lot longer. But I mean, the world doesn't work like that. You can't just sit, especially with the territory the size of China. So, the decline was probably already there when the British arrived, but it certainly accelerated as a result of their economic and then military interventions and led to the collapse of that regime in 1911, 1912.
It is often told of as a story of cultural complacency, of a great power that has no serious rivals, therefore also has no need to advance its technologies, to change its economic system. They're already top dogs, so why would they change? Only this awareness has made them unaware of the changes that happens elsewhere.
I think the British, when they encountered China, did get that impression that this was a place which was, sort of complacent, ossified. It was stuck in a kind of particular nostalgic past. One of the people that went to China in the first unsuccessful delegation from Britain to China, the government one, the Macartney delegation of 1793, a guy called John Burrow, he wrote this book afterwards about China as this stagnant, unchanging, sort of eternal thing that just liked to sit in its own world and had the cultural kind of arrogance, really. But I think we see it now as really that there was nothing but cognitive dissonance between British and Chinese and foreigners and Chinese. And a lot of what the foreigners thought was belittling them and, kind of these protocol issues was more about the Chinese just being very conservative and not really wanting to change, and not feeling they had a reason to change, even though the world around them was just, transforming. So it was more the circumstances than the agents. But I mean, obviously, the kind of belief by the British that the Chinese saw them as barbarians and culturally looked down on them became a big thing. And it still kind of lingers in a way, both ways. There's this sense of, I think when you put Europeans, British and Chinese together, there's always this sort of big protocol issue. Do you treat each other equally? Are you trying to sort of humiliate the Chinese again? Are the Chinese trying to make you kowtow, bow your head in front of them? It never quite goes away. It's stuck in this deep memory trace in this relationship.
It is perhaps also from a Western point of view, because China is the one great power that was never a colony, that that had its period of weakness. I think it's known in China as the Great Humiliation. Speaking of that, what is today the Chinese considered view, or the view of Chinese scholars of this period? How do they read it?
So a significant amount of research has happened in the last 60 years about the imperial period. And the state narrative is that it was the humiliation of China, the century of humiliation from the first Anglo-Chinese Opium War of 1739-42 to the catastrophe of the Sino-Japanese War from 37 to 45. And so almost for 103 years, China feels this history was an unmitigated disaster today. And when Xi Jinping heralded the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the Communist Party in 2021, he kind of spoke about this humiliation. It's there in the Constitution. It's everywhere. But I think, there are other scholars in China that come up with a more complicated history and do recognize that the Qing dynasty had its own internal profound problems. And it was humiliated because it was not able to defend itself. And the reasons it wasn't able to defend itself were, they give many, many reasons. There's one scholar who's written a history of the Opium Wars that, is very critical of the Qing too and uses Chinese sources. I think the other thing to really make clear is the Chinese at the time did not really know who the Europeans were. They had an idea of Europeans in the sort of 16th, 17th century because of the Jesuits, who were mostly from Italy, but who represented the Catholic Church. So they had an idea of this. They had some idea of an important, the Prussian, kind of empire or Ottoman. They kind of had an idea about this, but they didn't really have an idea about Britain until quite late. And certainly in the early 19th century, although British traders were based in China, for the imperial court, the British were Europeans until they started to work out that there were these particularly aggressive, unpleasant Europeans who were the British. And so that's when they started to think, okay, this is just very odd because there's okay Europeans, the Italians, French, Germans, they seem to be okay. And then there's these Europeans who are the British or the English, they called them, and they are really hard to deal with. And from that moment on, they definitely knew that there were significant differences within Europe. I mean, but from quite late.
What you're describing is very much also a history of mutual misunderstandings. One of the more entertaining moments of cultural misunderstanding is perhaps Karl Marx commenting on the Taiping Rebellion and saying now, finally, natural communism, because of course nothing could be cultural that came from outside the West, has finally found its way, and now this will be the inspiration for communist revolutions around the world. The Taiping Rebellion is one of those events that is not very well known in the West, but that was vast and a huge rebellion, 20 million dead or more. And it was a very curious state in the state that came about. That was a cultural experiment that seems to have failed tragically. Is there new research on that? Because what the conventional narrative is that it became its own little North Korea, basically.
Indeed, just on Karl Marx, obviously over the years I've taken Chinese visitors to Karl Marx's grave in London in Highgate Cemetery, and it's always very funny because Karl Marx, being based in London, obviously from the 1840s, wrote very little on China, and what he did write was very dismissive, and mostly he was criticizing British imperialism in China. He didn't really think China was significant. He was more interested in the industrialization of Europe. So it is very ironic today that he is the final place where he has the deepest influence still is China, which is the place he probably least took, kind of notice of. On the Taiping Rebellion, you're right. I think today the Chinese government has traditionally viewed it as a kind of anti-feudal uprising and regarded it almost as a class struggle. That was the classic sort of Maoist understanding of it. I think today foreign and Chinese scholars interpret it as firstly a kind of Han attack on the Manchu leadership. I mean, the Qing dynasty from the 1640s to 1911 was led by non-Han Chinese. Han Chinese make up about 92% of the population of China. But Manchurians, the Manzu as they're called, were a kind of northern tribe, basically, who dominated the regime at the elite level, had a different language. These days, they're highly assimilated. But, over this period, they were definitely different. And the Taiping Rebellion's leader, Hong Xiuquan, was a failed candidate for the imperial examination in 1850. He declared that he was the son of Jesus Christ and that he had some link. So it confused foreigners at the time because it seemed like a religious uprising. And they thought, okay, this guy's a Christian. We can live with that. We'll help him. And then they realized that it was actually highly nationalistic and that Hong Xiuquan took over Shanghai and large areas of that kind of border sea coastal area. And the British actually, with other Europeans, worked with the Qing to defeat the Taiping Rebellion. Eventually, it nearly felled the whole regime. So ironically, after attacking the regime, then the British and others defended it because they wanted to live with a Qing kind of court which was stable rather than this highly unusual hybrid semi-socialist sort of, regime, very, very kind of difficult to categorize. So I think today there's an understanding that this was as much an ethnic struggle as it was a political struggle, and that it did have a big meaning. At the same time, there was a thing called the Nian Rebellion, which was also pretty epic in the Xinjiang area, in the Muslim area of China. So the regime was under huge attack. The only final thing I say about the Taiping Rebellion is that it's the only conflict in all of the last 1,000 years in China that you would say would sort of look like a religious war. There were religious elements to it. One of the weird things about European history and Chinese history when you compare them is that religion was a cause of massive conflict in Europe, like the 30 Years' War and things like this. And in China, wars were not about religion. So that's a big, big difference that we still reflect on and think of different theories for why that was so today.
You mentioned the Anglo-China Wars, the Opium Wars, and perhaps just for clarification, because it's very nice. People from all over the world listen to this podcast. Not all of them know their Chinese history equally well. This is a strangely modern war. It's a strangely capitalist logic because it's all about access to markets. What happens is Europe wants to buy stuff from China, but China effectively wants to buy nothing from Europe, which incidentally is not so different from today. It's a big problem today, but then, it meant that too much silver stayed in China for the tea and the silk that Europe wanted. And therefore they decided, we will import opium from India, from northeastern India, where it was cultivated. And of course, that was a British colony. Ship it across, get lots of people addicted. And Bob's your uncle. We're rich. Which is pretty much exactly what happened. And when the Chinese resisted this, they were defeated militarily. This seems very much a 21st century logic about access to markets. We today still are more in the era of punitive tariffs, but who knows, perhaps access to markets can also be opened up with military force.
Yes, I think the Anglo-Chinese Wars, so they're called in China the Opium Wars. I use the less loaded term Anglo-Chinese Wars. Some Chinese friends get very annoyed at this and say, why don't I call it what it is? But I think the kind of issue that you explained, you described there, it's true that Britain was immensely frustrated by the fact that it was buying principally tea. It was the largest market for vast amounts of tea, silk, and other goods from China, but unable to kind of really sell anything to China. So it was giving silver bullion. I mean, China is a geography without gold and silver. So the Chinese wanted silver bullion, much of it from Mexico, and sort of like they were kind of really contributing to the enormous fiscal revenue of the Chinese state and getting absolutely nothing back. Opium was traded not by the East India Company, but by private traders, and grew and grew and grew to the point where it more than compensated for what Britain was exporting from China. But of course, it had enormous impact on society, and even the emperor apparently at the time was addicted. So, kind of a famous official, kind of Lin Zexu, kind of was sent by the imperial court down to Guangdong, where the canton today it's called Guangdong, but then it's called Canton. So he went down to the city of Guangzhou, where the British traders were, and had this massive clampdown on opium. The British were not happy. They sent increasingly high levels of people to deal with this, and then they sent famously a iron bottom sort of kind of ship, the Nemesis, which was able to totally destroy the Chinese navy. existed then as a navy. It didn't really have a navy. 4,000 troops from Britain, half of whom were from India, fought the Chinese and won easily because their armaments were just more advanced and superior. So it was kind of an amazing example of how you could force a market open through violence and through your, kind of improved technology. And I suppose it was a stark wake-up call to the Qing court because they realized they were dealing with a power that just had the ability to demand things from them they had no way of refusing, even though it was very remote. The Chinese didn't understand the enormous advantage that British naval superiority gave them. And therefore, from 1842, when the first treaty was signed, the Treaty of Nanjing, that opened up China. It created Hong Kong Island as a sort of perpetual kind of basis for British trade. It meant that the Chinese market was opened up through these 14 initially treaty ports. And it also created extraterritoriality for British people in China. They were not subject to Chinese law. They were subject to British law. So it was an amazing violation of Chinese sovereignty, which is, I think, why even today, these are called the unequal treaties. There were several more, many more afterwards. But the 1842 one was the most important and really started, I guess, the kind of decline of the Chinese state and the things that unraveled afterwards.
Speaking of the great reversal, do you think there might be a little bit of quiet satisfaction after opium pouring into China that now the base ingredients of fentanyl are imported from China into the United States?
It is ironic. History is often very, very ironic. And to hear America kind of complain about this today, I mean, legitimately, I suppose, it shows you these circles go around. And as you say, the complaint about China hoarding loads of foreign currency, it is a new story. It's not a new story. So it sort of makes me kind of wonder why, why we don't know how to deal with these things today, because our history shows we definitely should expect them, right? It's not like they're new. These are all, alas, problems that have been around for decades.
Well, that is something that we are talking about quite a lot on this podcast, the idea that the holiday from history is over, but that somehow people don't yet want to take that on board and believe that we live in the nastiness of a normal historical period with all that entails. But Kerry, we've been spending a lot of time now in the 19th century. It's time to, well, basically pass by the epic history of communist China under Mao, which would be 10 podcasts on its own or 10 large books, that some of which you have written already. And come to the second reversal point, because this humiliated China that you and I may have known in our childhood, not only as an extraordinarily closed place, but also a place of clumsy imitation of Western technology that was just sort of beginning. This country has pulled something off that is really historically absolutely extraordinary.
So I looked at the data the other day for Chinese per capita GDP in, well, as recently as 1997, when Hong Kong was restored to Chinese sovereignty, and today, 2026. Per capita GDP for Chinese in 1997 was about $800, and today it's $14,000. Hong Kong in 1997 per capita GDP was about $26,000. It's now about $54,000. Of course, Hong Kong per capita is way higher than mainland China, but the wealth creation and the way that China has lifted vast amounts of people into a wealthier condition, that is unprecedented.
When you say vast amounts, can you put a number on that?
So the World Bank says it's up to 500 million. Some people say it's as many as 800 million. I mean, it is significantly, hundreds of millions. This is unprecedented, and it's happened in a relatively short period of time. And you're right. I think that people me when I went to China in 1991 to Beijing. It had 2 metro lines. It was, a city with very few foreigners at that time because of Tiananmen Square. Not really many decent-looking cars. It was, a bit scrappy. There was still horses and carts in the street, and most people rode around on bicycles. Whereas I went to Beijing in October 2025. I mean, it's got, I think, 20 metro lines, brand new. It's got, 3 airports, one of which is brand new. It's got, incredible infrastructure, 6 ring roads. I mean, people drive around in cars that put the cars of Britain in, make them look like something out of a museum. And, technology is available everywhere. Robots show you to your room. You can get drones to deliver sandwiches for you. I mean, it's really an incredible transformation. And I suppose that has happened very, very quickly. It's not something we really have been able to catch up with very easily. So it is a massive, not a great reversal. This is a great transformation.
This goes into technology, where China is no longer just imitating Western technology, but building things that are a generation further than what's being built in the West. Also undertaking a vast technological transformation. And now comes the liberal but there's a price to pay, but the human rights. And this is a very legitimate concern. On the other hand, what interests me particularly is that you do not take that argument lightly, that you warn against our complacency, and that you say perhaps it is infuriating for the West to have one other culture that insists on having a genuinely different model and genuinely doesn't accept the base assumptions of our civilization. And that surely is a fascinating point that we're only just beginning to grasp.
Yes, I think if you look at Europe's engagement with China for 800 years, from the time of Marco Polo through the Jesuits in the 16th and 17th century, and the British and others from the 18th century onwards as traders, and then political and militarily, what do you see? You see Europeans perpetually mystified by Chinese being different and always trying to work out what do Chinese believe in. I get this asked a lot, what do Chinese believe, the Chinese leaders, what do they believe in? And I suppose it's interesting we still find each other quite different. I mean, I think the Europeans still are puzzled by this question. Why is China different? And I think in my memory, in the early 2000s, I did believe in the sort of universalistic creed of China embracing legal civil society and democratic norms. I thought this was going to happen as people became wealthier. It happened in Latin America. It happened in other areas of the world. Happened in Eastern Europe.
One would have said it's almost a historical law that as soon as there's a middle class, it will demand political participation, and therefore it will initiate a process of democratization. And that was widely believed that was only a question of time. And as wealth gets high enough and the middle class gets large enough, democracy will happen. Why didn't that happen in China?
Well, I think China is the great sort of, it seems at the moment China's the great disproof of this. Maybe things will change tomorrow. Maybe indeed people will start marching on the streets and, wanting more democratic rights. I think there were very complex reasons. One is the great financial crisis of 2008, which knocked the stuffing out of European confidence and American confidence. The other was the failure to really bring about proper political reforms during the Middle East uprisings, in the kind of the Arab Spring. They didn't end up the way the places people thought they would end up. And I think then the series of obviously political upsets in Europe and America, Europe, the travails of the European Union, Brexit, all these things creating instability even in previously a quite stable entity like Britain. And in America, the first and then second election of Trump and almost like civil war. I suppose that means that Chinese have become more suspicious, and they kind of feel like I don't think that the Chinese government or the people that I talk to think their system is perfect. And I mean, there's a whole spectrum of different sort of criticisms, but I definitely don't think that we've got answers anymore. I think that's the difference. So I remember doing a project on promotion of democracy in China in about 2008, 2009. And many people I spoke to, Chinese officials, academics, think tankers, they thought there were definite parts of the European American systems they were interested in. And I think that wouldn't be the case today. Many would say, we don't know what we're going to do. There will need to be change. But you guys really don't know what you're doing at the moment. And so we're just going to look elsewhere. People in the past talked about Singapore as a model, but Singapore is very small, very wealthy. And I don't think a 6 million strong city-state would be applicable to China.
Size of a middling town in China.
Indeed. But I think that there will be change. But China has always been very unpredictable and it's always surprised. So these days, I don't predict anymore. I just don't know what will happen.
This is a curious variation of the Great Reversal because after the Opium Wars, there was the Chinese self-strengthening initiative, and they decided we have to adopt Western technologies, we have to adopt Western science because that obviously makes them more powerful. But their ideas, their philosophy, we may not be so keen on. It was a very selective adoption of Western civilization. And now, basically, there seems to be very little hunger to adopt anything from the West anymore.
I think the most profound change in the Chinese view in recent years is this idea that their traditional culture is the source of their greatest strength, and that the West is culturally conflicted and divided, and the cultural wars are bringing us down, and that China will not go along this route. So I don't think it's really about democracy and political systems. It's about culture. And in fact, the most influential person in China on this is in the Politburo, a guy called Wang Kuning, a former academic who now sits beside Xi Jinping. He wrote a book in 1991, America Against America, which said America is amazing, incredible, and culturally incoherent, and it's doomed. So I think, right or wrong, and we can argue about that, but I think the Chinese view is culture is your greatest source of security. What are you defending? You can have all the arms and everything in the world. If you don't know who you are, it's a waste of time. So you get this again and again in Xi Jinping and other leaders' speeches today. It is good to be Chinese. You know who you are. You've got a 5,000 years history. You have a kind of very distinctive identity. We can definitely argue and say this is all made up, but it's compelling in people's imaginations. And I think it is regarded as the greatest source of their stability today. In the future, who knows?
Well, I mean, every identity is all made up, but no, but this is a really interesting point because you feel a great Western irritation and also a great Western inability to process the fact that this is a country that does not accept European universalism, that does not accept that certain ideas that were formulated in the Enlightenment or codified in the Enlightenment have to be true everywhere. And I have a feeling that often European, not only politicians, but also European thinkers have a great difficulty in processing that because it is such a principled refusal of these ideas. And there's a very different model on the other side. I'm curious to discover a little bit more about that very different model, that Chinese model, that other way of being that is not enlightened and universalist, that the Chinese pit against that.
So it's a complex and fascinating issue. The great Chinese philosophers from 2,300 or 400 years ago, Confucius, Mencius, and then latterly Juxi in the Sung dynasty 1,000 years ago, were ethical thinkers. There is no lack of ethical thinking in Chinese philosophy. I mean, not much metaphysics, but there's definitely plenty of ethics. So it is strange that we have this human rights kind of clash now and this clash of values. I think China, what's different, really, what is significantly different is that the West has dealt with China for a long time, particularly Europe, but we have not dealt with a confident China ever before. And that's different. And that has completely rattled people. And I think this is why when we see European leaders and European, particularly, kind of the European Union level, but also national leaders, it's really hard to kind of frame this discussion. I'm not critical of Europeans wanting this discussion, but their assumption that they are more valid and right than China is the problem. And it's very hard to have a discussion in China where you go with that mindset. I used to do it, and I have learned from bitter experience that it is a waste of time. So I give you a very current example. Personally, I am very sorry that Jimmy Lai, the Hong Kong publisher who's 78, has been jailed. And it is a terrible situation for 20 years. So it is a death sentence in a way. And he's not well. I think this is, what can be good about this? But I can also see why it is very hard with our history, with our mindsets, for any foreign leader, particularly a British leader or a European leader, to go to China and say, you're doing the wrong thing. Legal autonomy is something we all accept. No one likes other people to talk about their legal system. And we really need, I think the only approach is to beg for clemency, which is very humiliating, to literally say, please, this is an elderly man, be clement, be merciful. That's all. But apart from that, I do not know how you would politically say, if you do this, you're wrong, and we will meaningfully do something to sort of back that up. I don't see how that can be done now. It's not like China is going to be morally ashamed. It just believes that this is the right thing. You can do some things like the Xinjiang kind of clampdown and the repression there. You can certainly apply international pressure, and maybe up to a point that works, but not immediately and not obviously. But in these individual cases, it's very, very tough.
I am very interested in pursuing that a little bit more, and then I'm afraid I'll have to let you go. But few people in the West would disagree, or at least a lot of people would agree, that our societies have become incoherent, that they are dysfunctional, that our democracies are tottering, etc. You know the whole drill. And it is an interesting and worthwhile thought to pursue, whether the West has not been hoisted by its own petard and been forced into a situation of intense hypocrisy. I mean, this concerns things like migration. This concerns things like human rights. If everybody has the same human right to live a decent life, and that should be a right that is enforceable, then migration would be very different. And if 1 in 1,000 people in China felt politically oppressed and wanted to move to Europe, Europe would become very different. So these values are obviously no longer enactable. And therefore they have become indeed a source of hypocrisy. And I think especially the liberal progressive side of the world needs to think about that very carefully. So perhaps we should listen a lot more carefully to the Chinese criticism of the West, of the Western values, of Western practices. What do you think our incoherent societies can learn, if anything, from what China is doing? Because we are so comfortable in dismissing Chinese society, in saying it's cruel and saying, no freedom of speech, no press freedom. This cannot be a decent life. Obviously, hundreds of millions of Chinese people disagree. What can we learn from Chinese society today?
It's a great question. Dr. Johnson said, if you want to understand yourself, listen to your enemies, because they will have thought about you very deeply. And I'm not saying China is an enemy, but obviously it's very different. And we have, a quite kind of complex relationship. But I think the West needs to listen a bit more to what China says about never really crediting China with what it's done. I mean, I think it would be good for us to sort of not always go in with the negatives and then say positives, but actually sort of go maybe with more positives and say, yeah, this is an incredible transformation and you're doing amazing things in technology. And that would be the more important side, and then talk about the more difficult issues. I think that's one thing we can definitely try to do. Look, I mean, I think that China is going to be a problem, not because of communism and not because of necessarily cultural differences. I mean, that's significant. But I think China is producing a form of capitalism unlike the world has ever seen. That is a capitalism without social welfare. It is a capitalism without unions. I mean, this is why the alt-right in America, people like Elon Musk, they like China. It's cool.
They must get very excited about this.
Very excited. I mean, it's very hilarious. So I think we need to understand that social welfare model in Europe is really, it's great. We should defend it, but it's expensive. And China is competitive because it does not provide anything like the levels of social welfare for Chinese people, despite being a socialist system. And I think that that's going to be increasingly the issue, that competitiveness from China in terms of the technology it produces, the corporates it produces, the way in which it produces capital, the way in which it operates as a market kind of, sort of actor, but in a way which is pared to the bone. Chinese corporates like Huawei, BYD, the electronic vehicle company, are going to make Western corporates look very lazy and sluggish. It's already kind of happening. And I don't think we can play the security card, because security is also going to be a luxury, because China is going to basically say, you have your systems, that's great, you can carry on, but we're very competitive. If you want really, really good systems that you can afford and that will work, here we are. But go ahead and spend loads of money on different systems, because that's your choice. And I think that that's going to be more and more difficult. I mean, I'll just give you one final, very simple example. We talk all the time about, preserving, for instance, in Britain, our kind of, security, not having China involved in our telecoms and all the rest of it. But I mean, we can't really afford, to turn our back on Chinese technology if it produces some of these incredible things it is producing. We already had it a little bit with solar panels and then with EV batteries. But I think in areas like cancer treatment, pharmaceutical companies, we're going to be presented with things that China has we will definitely need. And I don't think we can continue with this sort of universalist versus communitarian sort of thing that we have. We're going to have a much more honest appraisal of what do we value more, pragmatic, practical relations with China, or do we want to carry on the values sort of debate? We can do both. We can do either, but we can't do both. And that's the China challenge.
On a more philosophical level, to close, Europe has been Christian, and that has been enforced with a lot of steel and blood. And this is a tradition that knows one revealed truth, and there's only this one truth, and then there are different heresies. China has been a very different culture with various coexisting religious traditions, such as Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism. And when we ask from a very Western mindset, what do people believe? Isn't that the wrong question to ask? Because, again, what is there to learn from 4,000 years of a Chinese philosophical tradition that does not operate with one monolithical truth that excludes all others in the same way as the West has done?
It's a very profound difference. And I think it's at the heart of why Europeans, Americans, whoever says that they're part of the political West today, China is complicated because it's a pluralistic intellectual culture and doesn't have these great kind of frameworks that Christianity gave Europe. And, there's not a sort of consensus on there being one fundamental, kind of belief, the existence or non-existence of God. I mean, that was the choice for much of European history, and then choosing which sect you wanted to believe in. But the big issue was that for China there was hybridity. There was always hybridity and pluralism, and today still I think China is very pluralistic. I'm explaining every day Marxism, Leninism for my friends, colleagues in China. I don't think that this is like sort of in the medieval period when someone's talking Latin and no one understands what they're talking about. It's an elite language. I mean, it's probably good to sort of end up with an anecdote, which taught me a lot about China. Some years ago, I think in about 2007, 2008, I was lecturing in Harbin, Heilongjiang, a very beautiful northeastern place, very influenced by the Russians, a very unique place, at the Institute of Marxism Leninism. I was invited to talk about Marx and the environment. You probably know Marx wrote very little about the environment. So I managed to scrape together some stuff, and I managed to give this lecture. And I think everyone was relieved. I hadn't said anything stupid. The director of the Institute of Marxism Leninism was very happy. I hadn't kind of made a big mess. So he took me to a bar afterwards. Harbin beer is a very nice local beer. And we got 2 big glasses of the draft beer. He was just about to lift it to his lips, looking like, everything was okay. And for some reason, I just suddenly leapt into my head. I said to him, "Do you really believe in Marxism, Leninism?" And he froze and literally kind of just looked at me like, "Would you shut up and drink your beer?" And I thought at that moment, yeah, the Chinese mentality is highly pragmatic and flexible. And there's the daytime when you talk about Marxism, and the night when you go to the bar and just live your life.
Kerry Brown, thank you very much for a wonderfully illuminating conversation. You have whetted my appetite to know more about China, certainly. If Kerry Brown has whet your appetite, there's a row of very distinguished books by him available to buy. The Great Reversal is the book that we've based this conversation on. And I thank you as always for listening, and we'll be back next week with another episode of the BlomCast. Thank you all very much.